Wow. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for this generous introduction. And thank you, I'd like to extend a big thank you to the organizers for inviting me so graciously to this fabulous event. It's really a pleasure to be part of it. So thank you for having me over. Basically, what I'd like to do today is to invite you to think with me about the value of things like anonymity and pseudonymity in digital cultures in general, and in queer and kink cultures in particular, by exploring precisely the notion of opacity. So opacity as forms of resistance, really, to dominating regimes of visibility on social media platforms, perhaps also in society at large. Across queer, post-colonial, and digital media theorizing, the notion of opacity, so opacity meaning being the quality of lacking transparency or translucence. Something opaque may also be obscure in meaning, so it can be difficult to understand, right? So opacity, I think, provides a really interesting way of challenging the Western idea of public visibility and identification as something which, really drives data cultures today, and something which also legitimizes sexual otherness, if we're thinking about acts of publicly coming out, right? To identify as other, to be recognized as other. So I guess in line with sort of discussions of tactical queer uses of digital media, in terms of, for example, disconnection. People have talked about disconnection and also reluctance as these tactics of resistance. Opacity then affords yet another way of thinking about resistance to platform power, resistance to user control, and simply how to refrain or to refuse transparent identification, and how that can be a radical act. So this is what I'd like us to think about today together, okay? So first, some context. So we all know this. So the ways in which sexual content and sexual expression is increasingly weeded out or sort of censored from large social media platforms in the interest of so-called user safety, as if it would make the user unsafe and not the advertisers. It has been discussed by both scholars and activists as a deplatforming of sex, right? So, this removal of sexual ways of connecting, sexual ways of relating, it involves not only a dismissal of gendered and sexual minorities for whom digital connectivity and community can be absolutely vital, but I think it's also, it's a dismissal really of the value of sex and pleasure in people's lives more broadly. And so in contrast to this then, I've been interested in looking at, to see what we can learn from more obviously sex positive platforms, sort of local alternatives to big social media platforms when it comes to alternative ways of thinking and resisting content regulation and platform governance. So this presentation then, it's based on an interview-driven ethnographic study of the sexual BDSM kink and fetish platform called Dark Side. But it's also part of this larger project that Sarah mentioned in the beginning, that I'm doing with Susanna Passonen and Katrin Tiedenberg in this periphery of Northern Europe where we're situated. So this is a project then which focuses on the value of sex-positive platforms in a Nordic and Baltic context. So even if I will be building on this case study, I will primarily go more conceptual today and think of ways of moving sort of between intelligibility and unintelligibility, or between ways of revealing and concealing as this alternate way of of existing really on platforms that typically demand that we reveal much, much more about us than we conceal. So yeah, I mean, the real name internet is strong here in this logic of revealing rather than concealing. So opacity then provides a way of making sense really of a set of tactics for sexually marginalized groups to exist, to resist and to transgress without becoming fully visible, without becoming fully graspable. But I'm also thinking that this argument could be useful to discuss marginalized groups more generally, who doesn't benefit from full visibility and transparency, right? So don't let the sex and kink fool you. It just happens to be my angle. But I mean, the argument could be made way broader, I think. But just, okay, so this is intentionally blank, so no need to, to worry. So if we think about sexual liberation just for a second. So sexual liberation is often understood within this framework of progressive Western modernity, right, of sexual rights. And it's typically linked to very particular forms of public visibility and pride, let's say. This is the logic. So then a lack of visibility and a lack of publicness is often imagined as the opposite of liberation, inevitably linked to oppression, to secrecy, to shame. But I think this is a little too easy a division between different things, because this focus then on public visibility as this universally empowering method of progressiveness and as an important grounds for cultural recognition. Surely it's a grounds for human rights and for sexual rights. But it does obscure the significance of sexual expression that is more marginal, that is more ephemeral or fleeting, and less than public, or public in other more subtle ways. I mean, public in a different way than a pride parade. I mean, there are, degrees here. It's not either or. So for those who cannot afford being fully visible and as such identifiable, so those who cannot risk being outed, the closet actually may not only be the space of oppression and shame. It can also be a space, I believe, of safety, a different set of possibilities, openings, and actually pleasures. So let's try and play with these binaries and see what else is there for us to think with. So this is the opening screen to Dark Side. I'm not going to show a bunch of material from the site for ethical reasons, but I'm going to tell you what it does and how it's set up. So, I mean, Swedish kink communities today, not only Swedish kink communities, but I think kink communities perhaps generally in the Western world are at once marginalized and seemingly mainstream, if we think of, 50 Shades of Grey or whatever, and navigating this really tricky balance between pop cultural visibility and lingering stigma. So in the Swedish context, so even if sadomasochism was depathologized in 2009, so it's quite recent, many testify to the stigma as very much a real thing also today. So Dark Side, it's a pretty vintage kind of a platform. It was founded already in 2003. So in internet years, this is a very long time. And it provides, as the site states, love and community in BDSM, kink, sex positivity, fetishism, expressions, and lifestyles beyond the prison of normativity. So quite a bold statement there. It's firmly set within this ethos of consent, of course, and mutual respect. So it's a platform for imagination and experimentation, sociality and self-discovery, flirtations for sure, and arousal, friendships and play dates. It houses everything from, social and sexual networking. It includes members' profile pages, lists of kinks, diaries, image galleries, libraries of written erotica. And it also has discussion groups and chats. It has event information and editorial material and ads. It needs to be financed somehow. But it's the same guy who built it in 2003 who's still pretty much single-handedly running it. So it's really this labor of love. He's not rich, but this is his child, right? So with its approximately 200,000 members, it's a vibrant place in Sweden, which is not a very big country. It's not only the largest Swedish kink community online, but actually one of few sizable national online platforms and communities which has not only survived, but actually has continued to thrive in the era of large US-owned, Chinese-owned social media platforms. So that's a pretty interesting case in that sense, that it clearly fills a function. And so, depending on, so when looking at digital practices on dark side, these are typically, they're not about concealed, closeted shame, for sure, but they are neither about a desire for full transparency and for full public recognition, given the stigma that is still there. So even if the site itself is governed by activist visions of openness and sort of proud outness for the sake of sexual justice, so it has a very sort of activist mode of governing the site. But users are actually encouraged to show their faces in their profile pictures. They don't have to, and many just do not do that because it's your face, but they are encouraged to do it. But the platform then primarily, it takes shape through these really tactical investments in obscure, partly concealed, but nonetheless proud forms of kink expression. So depending on your privacy settings, text and images can be shared in smaller or larger circles. They can be for your eyes only, completely private, for your friends list, or for the platform at large. So to be visible then for the entire platform constitutes a form of public kink visibility within the community, perhaps a way of becoming real to others, but without breaking down the walls to the outside world. So Darkside provides, in this sense, an opening for shared vulnerabilities, really, and collective forms of secrecy, reminiscent of what Claire Birchall calls in this book radical secrecy, which in the context of Darkside grants both privacy and sort of degrees of public kink visibility to its members. So Birchall, I don't know if you're familiar with this book, but so she imagines radical secrecy or post-secrecy as a mode of collective resistance, really, to both neoliberal transparency, the demand for transparency, and secret state surveillance in datafied societies, which I think is a really interesting position. So she argues, it has the subtitle, The Ends of Transparency in Datafied America. So she argues that to question transparency really in liberal democracies today is seemingly to be opposed to progress, right? To be corrupt, to be anti-democratic. But in this era of digital data and the power and economic value associated with its flows, with its accumulations, the question of, who has no choice but being transparent to the state, to corporations, and then who has the privilege of slipping by unnoticed is a much more complex thing, right? So her argument is that progressive goals would be better served by a radical form of secrecy. So she asks, how might transparency actually serve agendas that are far from transparent? And can we imagine a secrecy that could act in the service of rather than against a progressive politics? So dark side users, I mean, they are of course highly aware of how content posted on the platform might leak and end up elsewhere. This is how, I mean, platforms are permeable. So they always sort of insert measures of caution in processes of content creation. And I mean, we might all sort of recognize being cautious in how we create content and what we put online. But it might be even more sensitive here. So in the interviews, I've encountered things like concealed exhibitionism, which may seem like a contradiction in terms, right? Isn't the point to show yourself then? But it does involve practices of taking pleasure in putting, I mean, some things on display, like a naked body in restraints, while concealing others, such as a recognizable face. So to in this way move beyond identification without reducing the pleasure of sort of seeing and being seen, which I think is pretty interesting. Another example concerns hidden play in public. So there was this one queer female participant, and she told me about how BDSM literature written within the US context never spoke to her directly. It was culturally not as close as something in the Swedish context would be. And it wasn't until she came across a series of diary entries on Darkside that were chronicling secret play sessions at ICA. So ICA is the Swedish chain of grocery stores, right? So that's something really sort of fundamentally shifted in her. So she said, it made me aware of a completely different way of being in my sexuality, this parallel world that I share with others. So, I mean, just the idea that, you know, it could happen at the corner store in bright daylight, yet concealed. So it wouldn't be noticeable really for other people doing their grocery shopping. But then, of course, thinking about, I mean, the ways in which BDSM practices are haunted by stigmatization, it does shape partially closeted lives, for sure. But so let's think about the closet for a minute. So the closet is, I mean, it's a contradictory space. It's a space of homophobia, a space of kinkphobia. It supposedly hides sexual identities and desires. It turns them into secrets that can be revealed and somehow known, whatever it is that you think you know about that revelation. But as Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick delineates in the classic epistemology of the closet has had, I mean, of course, it has had this shaping presence in gay and lesbian lives post-Stonewall as this impossibly paradoxical space, really suggestive of wider social discourses of secrecy and disclosure, privacy and publicness, riddled with uncertainty. Well, I mean, the closet is commonly understood as a space of concealed desires, of shame, of longing, this deeply private architecture of loneliness where sexual expression is secret, identity is hidden. Sedgwick insists on the closet as something which shapes and constrains queer lives, but she also draws attention to the dangers, really, of this argument. So she says that there are risks in making salient the continuity and centrality of the closet. This will risk glamorizing the closet itself, if only by default, will risk presenting as inevitable or somehow valuable its exactions, its deformations, its disempowerment and sheer pain. I mean, it's not a fun place, right? I mean, there's of course very little glamour or value as such in how closeted lives are restricted and restrained. And yet, and so this is my sort of point or addition, the closet can also be something more vibrant, a place for intensity and desire to take shape and develop. It can be private, but it can also be shared. It can provide this temporary safe space and a form of shielding, really, from public witnessing, from normative regulation. So this is why I'm thinking that there could be value, let's see what you think, in what I call a closet positive analysis, which is basically what Nicolas de Villiers is developing in this book, Opacity and the Closet, I mean, he doesn't call it that, but it could be called that, I think. So he explores the queer potentials of partial disclosure. So by both idealizing and deconstructing the closet, he uses opacity as this conceptual device to break down the binary opposites of visibility and invisibility, privacy and publicness, secrecy and openness. So opacity for him, much like for myself, it becomes this set of queer tactics which, by precisely resisting legitimization via public outness, instead invent new forms of illegible sexual expression. And for sure, practices of opacity and obscurity are, I mean, particularly interesting in a time when large social media platforms keep careful track of their users' identities and movements for the sake of algorithmic capture, right? So to then withdraw from visibility, to withdraw from identification can be this radical act. So Zach Blas, that's interesting work, an artist and a theorist on what he calls informatic opacity. And he asks questions about who or what we make visible to technology by considering concealment and camouflage as acts of resistance to data-driven surveillance technologies. And of course, I mean, concealing the face as a political strategy to negotiate visibility and identification and control, it has a long activist history. So we can think of the Guerrilla Girls, we can think of Pussy Riot, we can think of many other things. And so to resist, yeah, I think it's important to also point out that that to, in these ways, resist dominating regimes of visibility can also limit severely the reach of cultural recognition and limit the reach of human rights and sexual rights. So, I mean, basically to fly under the radar often also means a lack of rights, right? So informatic opacity as envisioned by Zach Blas, so he says it's both liberating and oppressive, as informatic identification is linked more and more to governance, mobility, and freedom. Becoming informatically opaque can have excruciating political consequences, such as the loss of basic human rights. In spite of this, he says, informatic opacity makes a more sort of utopian gesture to exist without identification. So thinking about rights, so in the Swedish context, the law does not, for example, recognize BDSM as a form of sexual orientation, which means that it's not protected by laws that regulate discrimination in the workplace, for example. At the same time, I think Darkside also operates in line with this more utopian gesture that Blas refers to exist and resist beyond identificatory, tricky, transparency in a space where belonging at least partly takes anonymous and pseudonymous forms. So the discussion of opacity and obscurity across queer and digital theorizing that we've covered so far, it also owes a great depth to post-colonial thought. So in the work of the post-colonial Caribbean writer, poet, and philosopher Edouard Glissant, he insists, I mean, and quite powerfully, on the right to opacity for everyone as a tactic of the oppressed, right? So opacity has for Glissant the radical potential to challenge relations of imperial power, really, and also imperial control by refusing this understanding of the other through a logic of transparency. So he argues that the basis for understanding the other, so to speak, and thus of acceptance of the other within Western thought is transparency, measured against this ideal normative scale which inevitably reduces the other. So the right to opacity then is an ontological right, really, of the oppressed to be allowed to be non-transparent, to be non-categorizable, to be not fully understood and simply exist as different. So the right to opacity is a form of resistance to surveillance and imperial domination in this way. It's a powerful alternative to a politics of visibility and identity, which challenges Western epistemological desires to constantly transform opaque subjects into transparent objects of knowledge. And I mean, even if Glissant writes through the specific post-colonial conditions in Martinique, his way of thinking opacity in this ontological, ethical, and poetic way, it has a clear echo, I think, in the worlds of other minorities and the marginalized groups. Because what if sexually marginalized groups, such as queer and king communities, demanded acceptance without understanding? To just, I mean, you don't need to get it to respect someone. It's as simple as that, really. I mean, to just exist as different without being fully visible, fully graspable, fully understandable. Because thinking about it, I mean, I said earlier that, I mean, opacity implies a lack of clarity. So something opaque may be both too difficult, it may be both difficult to see clearly, as well as to understand. So, and I think that king communities exist to a large extent in such spaces of dimness, darkness, and incomprehensibility, partly removed from public view, also removed from public understanding, as non-practitioners may struggle to understand, may struggle to get it. You don't have to. I mean, and again, so King certainly enters the bright daylight of public visibility in some ways. So here you have 50 Shades of Kappahl. So Kappahl is this large Swedish chain of affordable fashion. And I mean, my interviewees, they just hate the level of, you know, the 50 Shades of visibility that ended up everywhere, and this big influx of newcomers that had no clue, right, to the platform that they had to sort of deal with. But it does enter the public view in particular ways, tied to practices that are visually striking, that photograph well. It can be artful, Instagram compatible shibari. It can be sort of sexy leather and latex imagery that doesn't conveniently get flagged by algorithms that regulate nudity. So that could be a tip. But I mean, but there is so much else in kink, right? So BDSM relationships that are less than visible, that are less than visual, may then not only make limited sense through the lens of mainstream culture, but also to the majority of dark side members, considering how the platform itself it's of course regulated by visual sexual norms and hierarchies. So it's not free from that, of course. But the site has gone through several makeovers over the years, but its aesthetics of sort of dark surfaces and allusions to leather and latex speaks most clearly to practitioners with a penchant for bondage and discipline, for physical impact play. It speaks to fetishists in the domain of dark, shiny materials, rather than those driven by practices that are not as easily visualized, such as, I mean, think of mental dominance. How do you take a picture of that? How do you make that social media compatible? Or not very popular fetishes drawn to, for example, knitted sweaters, like for the woolies. So it's quite a contrast to the latex and leather sexiness of the dark materials. So in comparison with such an immediately recognizable BDSM aesthetic with broad visual appeal, relations and practices that build on These more challenging mental processes are harder to show. They are harder to turn into images. They may then exist on the edges of otherwise marginalized sexualities. I mean, there are always margins on the margins, right? So, but following Glissant, we don't need to understand the other in order to accept them again, and just let them live as different. So in kink communities, you have the ethos, your kink is not my kink, but your kink is okay, which is precisely this live and let live philosophy. Because even if you may not understand someone else's kinks or desire, you support, you might fight for their right to express them and to practice them. So which really, what it does translate as is a form of solidarity across difference, right? Across or beyond understanding. I mean, it's about having a right to not make sense, really. If and when it works. I mean, as kink shaming in kink communities, it certainly exists, as sexual norms and hierarchies are drawn and redrawn when we move beyond vanilla. And I think there is a lot to say about being less than intelligible, really, to platforms and the ways in which they are governed. And I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on which ways we can think of to be less than intelligible. I mean, we could perhaps think of this in terms of algorithmic unintelligibility. What can we think of? What else is there that doesn't fit these image-driven social media platforms and the ways that they regulate such content? I think there is a lot of untapped potential in other modes of expression, also than the visual. We can just think of sound, for example, for one moment. So I'm currently doing a little project on audio porn, sound porn, or sound erotica, which is app-based. So it's part of the App Store's content regulations, policies, and all of that. But I mean, so in this contentious app-based digital landscape in which we move, which severely then limit the sexually explicit, especially on visual terms, there is, interestingly, I think, more leeway, at least right now, for audio formats, for example. So given the strong connection between porn and visuality, the domain of sound porn or audio erotica, while not completely free from regulation in its app-based form, it does allow for certain sexual expressions to more easily fly under the radar. I haven't thought about it too much yet, so we can also think about that together, maybe. Just finally, so to move beyond intelligibility, it also resonates with how BDSM scholars have discussed desire and perversion in terms of the unspeakable. So Ariane Cruz in this beautiful book discusses unspeakable pleasures in pornographic race play and Black female objection. So seeking to then speak the unspeakable or comprehend the incomprehensible quite powerfully, I think, delineates a domain which actually escapes the very grasp of comprehension. So, and then opacity, similarly, it works to overcome the risk of reducing, normalizing, and assimilating sexual otherness by comprehension, by understanding, and instead open up for new modes of obscure, liminal, and pleasurable sexual expressions and transgressions on social media platforms and beyond, and for simply existing as different. Thank you so much.
Wow, merci beaucoup. A lot to digest. I think we're open for questions just right off the bat. Oh, here and up there. Merci beaucoup. Ouais.
Thank you for that. It was really interesting, and it gave me a lot to think about. I also work on opacity and transparency in a different format, but a lot of it is applicable. So this is going to give me a lot of food for thought. A question I have is, what do you think of the role of academia as a core consumer and author of transparency? Are academics made collaborators to colonial impulses via charge to categorize and place the obscure, conducting and publishing research drawn from, for instance, grants speaking to principles of transparency or accountability?
Yeah, I mean, so this, of course, is how research or science, how it operates. And so it's not obvious how or if we can challenge that. But we could, I think there is a lot to do methodologically in terms of how we think of our research participants. If we involve people in our research, and to try as much as we can to not reduce them to these transparent knowledge objects, and make them more of co-creators, thinking about research ethics in a different way, maybe. I mean, this is already being done in certain forms of qualitative research, but I think so we can learn a lot from sort of reflexive modes of ethnography and sort of feminist and queer methods in thinking of the people that we research and their role in our knowledge production and how it benefits them. Yeah, thank you.
Great question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So in the last 10 years in my queer circle, there's been, so I want to jump back on the last question, pointing out that sometimes the calls to transparency comes from the base, and social media platform activism has been a case for that. So in the last 10 years, I saw Friends Amplify Voices asking, for instance, calling out Andrew Garfield in a very famous Arcade Fire video, We Exist, who seemingly plays a transgender woman and being called out for perhaps not being a transgender woman. And there was another famous case, I think, where I think it was Viggo Mortensen was supposed to play a gay man, and he was called out by activists on social media, like, for not being gay. And I think the moment for me of the tension, I saw the division in the community and the calls for transparency coming both from being exposed brilliantly from the top, but also from the base. Viggo Mortensen, or correct me if it's another actor, but I think he said, "What the fuck do you know? Like, perhaps I do suck cock from time to time," something like that. And so the calls for transparency might come from the platform-based social activism that we see. And so it's really, really hard. I'm not calling it out myself right now. I'm just trying to reflect. Like, we live in a space where some people will be asked to come out as models, to embody certain ideas and activism, and how can we force? For me, it's never good to ask someone to be transparent if it might put them in danger, for instance. But some social media activists have made that claim that if you're in a Hollywood movie, your identity belongs to the world for some reason. So I wanted to know if you reflected on that.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm also thinking of how in sort of gay and lesbian and then queer activism, I mean, the demand for public visibility as the way of reaching recognition and the way of getting rights, sort of very basic rights, has been a powerful move. But it's never the entire story, right? I mean, as you say, for those more at risk to violence, it's not as self-evident to come out, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're ashamed of yourself. It's just the complexity of the question, and also and also the disregard for, I mean, it's a very Western notion. I mean, the Pride Parade, as this, it's a very Western notion of what liberation, what sexual liberation looks like. I mean, I was doing sort of teacher exchanges in Beijing a couple of times and connected with the queer community there, sort of the Chinese queer community, which is, I mean, for very good reasons, extremely underground. I mean, it's not illegal, but come on. So, and they were, I mean, they had a very rich set of tactics to deal with that, to be proud and celebrate themselves without making noise, and without being visible in a sense that would be readable and understandable by the officials. So it's a different form. I mean, this was queer activism, but it was much more subtle in Western eyes, subtle, and it was sort of semi-public, or not quite public, but almost. So it was very coded and but really interesting, and it really makes you think about, I mean, the Westernness of this notion of proud outness and how that should be something that we all would want to strive for. So I guess my point is that it should be, your rights should not depend on that. To be recognized in the eye of the mainstream and understandable in that sense.
Hi, thank you. Well, first, this isn't what I was going to ask, but this conversation has been making me think about some of the tensions involved when we're talking about not just social media representation, but commercial media representation, and then the way people engage with that within social media in terms of visibility and the tensions between that and when it becomes transcultural. I was specifically thinking about recent developments in Chinese drama, where queer novels were being adapted, Dame novels were being adapted, but in very coded ways, but they slowly became more and more, the coding was more and more overt until the government clamped down, and now everything is much, much more under the cover. But it was because people were posting on Weibo and interpreting in much more explicit ways these things that the creators had strived to keep at a certain level of code. So that negotiation of what is opaque versus what is transparent, and then when it loses control of the individual putting the meaning out in the first place, or the corporate putting the meaning out in the first place.
Yeah.
I don't think I can make a smooth connection between that and my question, but I was really interested in the fact this is a case study of a specific community in this kind of older format that sounds like ambivalently resisted the coming of the young people inspired by 50 Shades of Grey.
Not only young.
Yes, all the much broader, I think that's similar, the much broader publicity and visibility that 50 Shades of Grey meant that people would come to this community. But I'm assuming, I just would be interested in hearing your thoughts about how this type of negotiation between opacity and transparency plays out in other forms of social media that are less protected, maybe that people participate in as well, or if people don't know to find their way to this community, how you see that playing out in relation to what you saw in your case study.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that question. Well, I mean, first of all, the dark side, it doesn't exist as an app, so it's not part of the App Store. So it very sort of consciously not an app, which makes it much more free. It opens up a space. But you were asking about the people coming in. The 50 Shades of Grey.
More about the ones who didn't find their way in,
No, sorry. Yeah, I was just did this Zoom sort of blank thing while I'm here. That's interesting. So I mean, we did look quite a bit at how, I mean, how this is of course not only the only social media platform that they that is part of their sort of social media ecology. So they move, I mean, and very fluently between platforms and sets of content regulations and sexual norms and ways that you can express or cannot express yourself. And so they did reflect a lot on how they need to be much more careful on, say, Facebook and Instagram and places like that, and how they might still. But again, I mean, they sort of read each other between the lines even on those platforms. So they might pose sort of casually with, you know, a subtle choker, or they might use like the heart and fist emoji, like in a combination that could be sort of ripe for interpretation for those who knew what that could possibly mean. So they would sort of signal in that sense, and they would also, I mean, they would also sort of take pleasure in being in the company of people that they knew belonged to this community, even if it's on a very different, more sex negative, if you like, platform. So I'm thinking of that it's quite similar to how munches and sort of casual gatherings in the kink world functions, where people would gather, you know, on a cafe or in the pub. They might not even talk about kink, but they just know that they are in the company of sort of friends and allies, and just that knowledge creates this form of normalcy, really, in the everyday, and even in places that are not for them explicitly, if that makes sense. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I guess I want to ask you a question about platform history, because you brought our attention to the fact that Dark Side was started in 2003, and you know, I have a student who's working on Pornhub, and there's a crazy opacity to that kind of weird history of that website, and you you kind of counterposed the dark side to the you know, the kind of large Google sort of corporate platforms, and that it's still run by the same person. And I guess I was wondering just to hear more about like the kind of conditions that made it possible to continue this without, you know, being displaced or replaced by larger, and then maybe even a reflection on like transparency, opacity of the kind of history of this platform itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting that. I mean, I've seen this place. It has evolved, but it has also stayed very much the same. So I mean, I use the term vintage. So it really is that. So it has this, you know, old school feel to it. So, but I think which also speaks to sort of the main demographic. So people in their late 30s, early to mid 40s, actually coming of age at a time when this was their internet. So sort of coming of age sexually when, you know, when this was the kind of communities and that they had and that they sort of grew. So I think there's also nostalgia involved, but the functionality is also a bit lacking. I mean, especially when I talk to gay male users, there is not even a messaging function. So if they try to use it as a hookup app that's really not built for that, it can still be done. But, you know, when someone says, if I have this 30-minute window opportunity, I'm not gonna bother with dark side, even if it's, I mean, it's good in a sense that the kink framing is already done, so you don't have to negotiate that. I mean, there's still a lot to negotiate, of course, but so it's really not a hookup app, but it can be used as one if you're more sort of, if you have more time and if you're more patient. So lacking in functionality, but it's also, I mean, it's construed as a safe space, really, for its members, but it's a safety that is sort of conditioned. I mean, in the interview that I did with the webmaster and long-term administrator, I mean, he says that the site, it has a pretty good safety net. A lot is being automated. It was sort of GDPR compliant long before GDPR even was there. And so consent being key, then non-consensual dick pics is really not the way to go here. So you might think that would be okay, but it's not. So that's one form of sort of image-based abuse. And he says, I have a quote here, it would be epic if Darkside gets this reputation that no one dares to send juicy dick pics to strangers because they get all sensitive and PC about it. So he wants to sort of take that, the automation practices around reporting non-consensual dick pics sort of one step further to just automatically send a report to the police. So this is Sweden at its best, right? It's sort of zero tolerance for that kind of sort of sexual harassment or sexual, or annoyance. I mean, it could be also violence, or just not what you want or didn't consent to. I mean, we can talk more, but yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. So no, I love how you present the fact that the landscape in which we are, it's a very modernist one. What we saw yesterday with the story of Netflix and the platforms, which really arrange our way of seeing things in a very clear manner.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked a lot in the afternoon about representations which are queer, which are open to all sorts of identities, and how it is felt as important for viewers, for our students too. Well, it's something that they really try to understand better, and there's a very enthusiastic view which is linked to a modernist view, which I think is very useful, and we should talk more. So I guess my question is about the need for expression, the limits of expression and representation. So if you could dig more into these terms, as well as maybe a more concrete question. You talk about the public sphere in Sweden. So my question was, and how the sensitivity is in a certain way, which is not comparable maybe to other countries. Think of Italy, for example, or other countries in which the public discourse is very polarized and makes it very hard for queer people, as it's increasingly becoming the reality here too. So I'm guessing, does this space change over time in what we saw since 20 years ago, in response to changing in public discourse, or you feel that in Sweden is not as, historically, how is this changing, knowing that the public discourse and the media representations are increasingly working on new representations and new identities?
Well, I think currently we're moving backwards in time, also in Sweden, and in terms of the polarization. And this is very noticeable if you're a queer scholar, if you're in gender studies. I mean, they just love to hate us. So politically, it's not an easy place right now in Sweden either. So there is a lot of nationalist sentiment and sort of, anti-gender ideology, as they call it. It's convenient shorthand for all kinds of things. But I think so. There was an interesting moment in Sweden and in the public sphere around from like early 2000 and around 2005, or between 2000 2010, with a pretty clear, with a lot of sort of vibrant, interesting queer activism. I mean, there is still interesting queer and trans activism, but it was, to me, and I mean, this could also speak to my age, I think it had this moment that was much more hopeful. And there was a development of a particular sort of Swedish brand of sort of queer feminism. I mean, really a coming together of queer theory and feminist theory and activism. So this brand of queer feminism really brought together a lot of important things and made space for a range of queer expressions to exist publicly. But there is much more pushback now. And so, which makes it even more precious, I think, to have these digital spaces, right, where you can just be. And even if, I mean, and like I said, I mean, they're very aware of that what they post can end up elsewhere. I mean, there has been these scandals of, you know, image dumps ending up on porn sites taken from dark side, which really, you know, violates sort of fundamentally the trust that people have for the platform. So it's not, you know, you can never be completely safe. But I think this could be one reason why it has stayed strong and as big as it is, that the need is there to have this form of semi-public space for this community in particular. I mean, there's more to say, of course, about this Swedish public sphere, and but yeah.
Well, please, thank you so much,
What?
Danny. This has been wonderful.